Hey, good evening, everybody. I am Rick Wilson, and I am joined tonight on the strategy session by the great Stuart Stevens, the great Joe Trippi, and the amazing Anne Applebaum, the author of a new book about autocracy that will leave you lying awake at night wondering what the hell is going to happen to us all. And thank you for joining us tonight. I want to say first off, you and I spoke about a week ago on my podcast about the book, and I thought a lot about it in the last few days, and I'm glad you're back with us because I think we have an interesting example today or this weekend of a true small d democratic style president not making the autocratic play to hold power at any cost. I was curious what you thought about that from this weekend, and then I want to dive in on the book, and we'll do a lot of Q&A tonight with Stuart and Joe.
So one of the arguments of the book, and maybe we'll talk more broadly about it as well, but one of the arguments of the book is that the nature of modern autocrats is that they are transactional. So most of them aren't ideological in the old-fashioned sense. I mean, they have ideologies. Obviously the Iranians have an ideology, the Chinese have the Communist Party, but mostly they're interested in themselves and their power and their money, sure. And that's their priority. And there was something about Biden's decision to resign because it was good for the country that was rather moving. I know he was under pressure. I know he at first argued against it. He didn't want to do it. And then as it became clear that his age was a huge problem for voters, he decided that that was more important than him insisting on trying to remain. And it was admirable.
I thought so as well. Well, Stuart and Joe, we haven't been on this show since the decision. I wanted to get your thoughts both. Let's start with you, Joe, on where you see the impact of Biden's decision.
Well, first of all, I agree with Ann, but also I think what's significant about this and what a lot of people are missing is he isn't just passing the torch to Kamala Harris, but I think we're seeing a whole lot of a new generation of Democratic leaders get some focus and spotlight on them. I mean, everybody from Whitmer, we know them, but Whitmer, Shapiro, and so many others, Steve Beshear, Wes Moore, I think they're all going to be a major part of this this campaign now, and that's I think it's really important. I think you're seeing that energy, particularly with younger voters, and it's going to get even bigger because it's broader, it's bigger than Kamala. He literally has stepped off the stage politically, at least in a way that is going to launch a whole new generation of new leadership in the country. And I think the country's yearning for that, particularly juxtaposed to Donald Trump and MAGA.
Yeah, I think that's very right. So, Stuart, how about you?
Well, I'm more interested in what Ann has to say. I think it's been an extraordinary period. I'm shocked that the Democratic Party didn't screw it up, and very pleased and grateful. I think that this could have gone sideways in a lot of different ways and wasted another 3 weeks that would have been very difficult to get back. But, Ann, I saw a tweet of yours that I thought was just fascinating. No one's talking about it a few weeks ago, I guess, that with all the talk of the far right in Europe, I think I'm getting this right. You were positing that what Trump is more radical than any of the stuff that's going on by the far right parties in Europe. That he really was a true radical. Is that a fair summation?
I mean, Trump is far more extreme than any of the current far-right leaders who are in politics now. I mean, obviously, he's not more extreme than some strange neo-Nazis and so on, but if you compare him to Marine Le Pen or Geert Wilders in the Netherlands or, all of those are people who claim at least to want to work with allies. I mean, it's a different political system, but they have coalition partners and they talk about working within coalitions. They talk about working within institutions. A lot of them, in order to get elected, have made attempts to sound more moderate, or they've surrounded themselves with more moderate people. So there's a there's a clear effort to move to somewhat to the center, and really all of them have done it. And Trump has done the opposite. I mean, he's more and more extreme. He picked an extreme running mate. His language is not at all conciliatory. It's not at all coalition building. I mean, I went back and reread his acceptance speech from the Republican National Convention on Monday, and it's remarkable. I mean, he couldn't stay on the script. He couldn't talk about unity. He couldn't talk about even his own assassination, but the attempted assassination. He couldn't talk about it without veering off in other directions. And then, of course, if you stayed up to watch the whole thing, the end of the speech was his rants about chaos and disaster and crime and insane asylums and Hannibal Lecter and something about Venezuela that I didn't understand. And that's who he is. And nobody talks like that in electoral politics in Europe. So he's really very very far out of very, very different from even the so-called far right leaders in Europe.
That's interesting you mentioned that, Anne, because I was interviewing a guy today who has studied some of these other populist leaders, and he did say that a lot of the other populist leaders in the world don't have the same latitude Trump does because of how much media power he has, how much ability to command media attention, whereas a lot of the other authoritarians, whether it's Orban or Erdogan, they still have to play the politics of their country more than just a sort of media game. And Trump has such a command of press and media that it advantages him as an autocrat.
Yeah, I mean, then there are some autocrats who control all of the media. I mean, Orban controls all of the media, so he doesn't have. There isn't. I mean, there are some websites and there are a few other things, but he doesn't really have any media opposition at all. In fact, I once heard him speak at a conference where he was asked by some kind of sycophantic, actually, unfortunately, Americans who are president, oh, Mr. Orban, how do you stay in power so long? And one of the first things he said was, well, it's very important not to have any media who are against you. And by that, he meant he doesn't want any criticism. He doesn't want any transparency. He doesn't want anybody writing about corruption, and he doesn't want any real opposition. And so, and Trump doesn't have that. I mean, we have opposition politics and opposition media here, but it's true that even as a out of power ex-president and one who was not that long ago quite disgraced, he does have these boosters and in the media, whether it's in social media or whether it's through Fox or whether it's Newsmax. I mean, he does have these outlets that are extraordinarily loyal to him for reasons of their own.
Can you get into a little bit about how you see social media as a threat or as a participant in all this, or how he's using it, or how they're using it to gain this power, and what you think we can do or should do?
So let me revert a second to the book. So the book is called Autocracy Inc, and it's about this network of dictators. It's a particular group of dictators who work together, both to keep one another in power, but also to undermine democracies, and that's because they see the language of democracy, transparency, rule of law, as a threat to their form of power. And one of the things that they've done is they've carved out and worked over many years. They've created a kind of autocratic narrative that is designed to create an image of autocracy as safe and secure and stable, and democracy as weak and divided and actually degenerate, even sexually degenerate, and they use this narrative. I mean, this narrative links together all of their news coverage, all of their descriptions of the world are seen through that lens. And there is a version of that which is now not just available in the United States, and it's not just, I don't know, on Russia Today or Chinese state media. It's repeated and used by a part of mostly of the Republican Party. There's a version of it on the far left too, but it's not that big in the United States. And there's and so it's almost like there's a kind of two-headed monster. I mean, on the one hand, Americans, and on the one hand, Russians and Chinese and so on are often working along the same themes and using the same playbook. And so that's one of the arguments of the book. Social media plays a role in this, in that the way the big social media platforms work is that what spreads and what gets attention and what you see is determined by algorithms that favor emotion and anger and division, and ultimately polarization. And so that is now, for many people, and even for many journalists and for many people who shape other media, their main source of information. I think that's changed the way that we talk about politics quite a lot.
Interesting. This global network of authoritarians, they are bound by a kind of nationalism and a kind of ethno-nationalism in most of these cases. A lot of them, for a long time in America and in some of the European leaders, they've sort of looked to Vladimir Putin as their role model. Where do you see Putin? I mean, aside from being thrown out a window in the immediate future, where do you see Putin right now in that space? It's gotten harder, I think, for some of them to defend him as the war in Ukraine has gone on. And I wanted to get your take on that situation.
If you're talking about leaders of Europe, I mean, he's done a lot to muddy the waters. So, offering people alternate explanations for the war. I mean, this is a colonial war of occupation. It's a European war. It's about erasing Ukrainian nationality, and it's about recreating some kind of Russian empire in its place. And he's done a lot to muddy that, to convince people that it's really about NATO, or it's really about American biolabs that were in Ukraine. That's a conspiracy theory. It's not true.
Sure.
And he attempts to show the West as aggressors. And for people who don't like the West or who don't like the United States, sometimes people pick up that narrative. So he's done a lot to muddy it. I mean, it's true that in Europe, where people feel the Ukrainian invasion as a kind of direct threat to them. I mean, because there are countries who can see we would be next, or we may be the ones who need air defense soon. The war it feels closer than obviously it does to us, and so it's harder to excuse or explain away, and to use some of the Russian narratives that you can hear, very often in the United States, indeed on the floor of the Senate, you can hear them being used. So most of the European far right have become more wary of him in recent years, but I don't think the American far right has at all. I think they still see him as an admirable figure, one to follow and admire.
I think that's right. Stuart, what you said?
Yeah, and I was interested when we spoke in 20 as part of a little Lincoln Project Zoom that we had. You were, I thought it was fascinating. You were talking about how these movements position themselves as movements and how they rally people to them. And you were arguing that those of us against Trump, needed to do that more. To reinforce that there's more of us than there are of them. I'd love if you talk some about that, because I thought it was such an interesting insight.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned a lot from the people who fight real autocracies. I mean, that's not obviously what we have. And also, I learned a lot from watching the most recent Polish election, where you had a kind of autocratic ruling party was in charge of the country for 8 years and went a long way to undermine institutions and to degrade the judicial system and so on. I mean, much as you can see beginning to happen here, and you can imagine getting much worse. And the campaign against that party, and which ultimately was victorious, it began with a huge amount of grassroots campaigning, kind of on the ground campaigning. And the key point is that they had their huge protest march before the election. So, the thing that happened in the United States and after the 2016 election, where there was this kind of mass march of women, there was a women's march, there was some other marches after the election. I mean, it's too late. You have to have the march beforehand.
Right.
And you have to have your democracy movement and your sense of organization and energy needs to come before the campaign. And actually, one of the things I was the most worried about in the U.S. election is I didn't feel that at all up until Biden's resignation. I just wasn't seeing young people involved. I didn't see people wearing T-shirts. I mean, some of that is not all that. I mean, some of it is stupid, and some of it is, but some of it is, people want to feel they're part of something meaningful, and I didn't see that the so-called democracy movement in America had that, or it wasn't a movement. We're in now. We're speaking on day 2 of the Kamala Harris presidential campaign.
Right.
It's a little early to make any predictions, but I have young adult children, and I can see them already online, whatever it is, looking for the coconut memes and the music videos. I mean, there seems to be a feeling that maybe now we could create something like that, or we could. You were speaking earlier about this team of people. I mean, all the people you've just mentioned, if you had, Whitmer, Shapiro, the governors of Kentucky and California, and if you had them all campaigning, all working on the ground, in not just in their states but in other states, and you had Harris, someone who was able to do that kind of campaigning as well, you could imagine suddenly within a month or two a very different feeling here. I'm not saying that's what's going to happen, and I was just on a call with somebody who was predicting another catastrophe, so maybe that won't come to be, but there's a chance anyway.
No, I think it's very likely you'll see a next gen tour. I mean, where they literally 2 or 3 of them go with her to this state, go with her to that state. And it really is about the torch being passed to the next generation of leadership, including trying to pull in some Adam Kinzingers and others. So I think that energy that we're feeling, can they parlay it? Can they keep it going? But I think if they're smart, and I hope they are, that's the direction they go in, because I agree with you that we need to make it a movement.
I do think you're right. I think there is a feeling there of something came unstuck after Biden resigned or pulled out of the primary. Something came unstuck, I think, in the minds of a lot of voters like under 35, where they felt like, Harris may be 20 years older than them, but she's not 50 years older than them or 40 years older than them. Yeah. So I think there is a sense that we may have crossed some sort of borderline where somebody closer to their generational concerns has a moment in the spotlight. I think it attracts a lot of interest and a lot of energy into this process that definitely was not there when and God bless him, but when President Biden was in this position, it didn't feel the same. You didn't feel that same level of engagement with people who are under 35.
It was a repeat election. I mean, it was the same election we had last time. And, and this is now Trump's 3rd campaign. So it's very hard to gin up the same amount of energy. But the stakes are high. And again, just to bring back to the subject of my book, I mean, this is a moment when, the question of whether the United States is going to remain a leader of an alliance of democracies. I don't just mean in Europe, but around the world. And whether the United States will continue to speak for values like transparency and the rule of law, whether we will continue to have that role, or whether we will become, a part of the autocratic world, yet another transactional power whose leader looks for his own advantage in any diplomatic meeting, whether political or financial, for himself or for some of his close business partners. And it felt like to me like there was this horrible risk that might happen. And if this campaign can just raise some awareness of the dangers and of what's at stake, if the Harris campaign can do that, then it'll have done a great service to everybody.
So, Anne, one of the things, you in this book, I want to have folks hear, like, what is it that the pro-democracy side in the global sense? I mean, we have had some good news lately in the UK, in France, and in Poland. We've seen changes in those countries that defied the idea that once you go autocratic, you never turn back. or once you go nationalist or populist, you never turn back. What is it that we can be doing in America and beyond as pro-democracy crusaders that helps build the predicate for victories like they had in France, like they had in Poland, like they had in the UK?
So a lot of it is, I mean, as I said, a lot of it is about this grassroots campaigning. You can't reach people from above. A lot of it is about using every single form of social media possible. Even I saw that Harris's campaign has opened an account on Truth Social. I mean, and that's what you need to do. I mean, you need to go everywhere people are reading stuff. And
fight them where they are.
Wherever people are, you have to be there. I mean, I would ban TikTok, but if I were running for president, I would have a TikTok account and I would be really engaged there, and I would have lots of other people who were also engaged there. So that's a part of the answer. Part of the answer is also, if you look at France, is about forming coalitions, knowing, the defeat of the French far right was possible because of a coalition that stretched from really quite extreme left all the way through this, the center left and the center right, and it was a very big, wide group. And they made a kind of pact. I don't want to go into the details of the French electoral system. There was a kind of pact made informally and really rapidly. I mean, within a few days, in between the first and second rounds of their elections, where they essentially agreed to cooperate and make sure that they didn't win. And that's kind of the spirit. I mean, the spirit has to be everybody who we can bring in, even if they didn't vote for us before, even if they don't usually vote. I mean, look for allies everywhere in every state. Another thing, the Polish prime minister who won the election in October, he made a point of campaigning in places where he wasn't going to win. So it's as if Harris were campaigning in red states. I'm not going to win here, but I'm going to show people here that I care about them too, and I want to be also their prime minister. And there's something that I honestly think Harris should think about, campaigning in red states, in red districts, in places where she might not win. I mean, I know that U.S. campaigns are so compressed, and we're such a huge country, and people feel they have to hit Wisconsin, Michigan, Arizona, Nevada over and over and over again. But I think she should consider campaigning in Kentucky or Tennessee, just to show that she can have an appeal in places like that, and that she cares about those communities, and that would have a knock-on effect in other states. I mean, you have to show that you want everybody, that no one is excluded as a potential member of your coalition, and I think that's definitely a lesson from France and Britain as well. I mean, actually, the British lesson, what Keir Starmer, who's now the Labour Prime Minister, did, really ruthless party management. I mean, the party itself, being a kind of winning machine instead of being a talking shop, a kind of ideological debating society. And maybe the Democratic Party has learned that too. I don't know. We'll see. I mean, but that was another piece of what they did that changed their image and changed the way they ran their campaign.
Well, they certainly were. They certainly were over the last week or so. Seem to have gotten that lesson. I mean, it was pretty brutal, but effective. So we'll see what they do.
And I wanted to ask kind of almost a book process question here. When you wrote that incredible article that we're losing for the Atlantic, did you have a sense then that this would become a book, or was it
the bad guys are winning article?
The bad guys are winning. Yeah.
No, actually, I mean, I it was only after I wrote it that actually one of my publishers and some people I work with said that should be a book, because it's a bigger subject. In the Atlantic you have whatever, you have a lot of space. You get 6,000 words or 8,000 words or something, but there's a lot more of that story. And actually, in the couple of years that have passed since I wrote it before the war in Ukraine. And so since I wrote it, the story has evolved and it's become more serious. And the collaboration between Russia, North Korea, and Iran, which wasn't visible previously. I mean, you can see it now. I mean, the North Koreans give ammunition to the Russians, and the Iranians are making drones for the Russians, and the Chinese are enabling the Russian defense industry to recover by supplying them with components. And so some of this, which looked more murky 3 years ago is now on the surface. So
Right.
I think what I saw then was something that was developing in a particular direction, and then there's more of it.
So, and you're in reading a lot of your past books, I mean, you seem to get it eventually. I mean, because of subject like autocracy and what they're doing, you tend to get to some optimistic view of how this could go. Do you have one? I mean, I mean,
yes, please.
We're open to.
So I get asked this all the time. I've written some very gloomy books. Partly I do it, because I feel it's very important to be, go to the darkest things that are happening or have happened and explain them, and explain how we can prevent them from happening again, and start the conversation. I've said this many times. I mean, I think it's very irresponsible to be pessimistic. I mean, who am I to say, it's all darkness and everything is gloom? I mean, there are a lot of younger people who still have their lives in front of them, and I can't tell them not to do anything. But also, I honestly believe that there is no arc of history. There is no inevitability. There's no reason why the United States will fail or will succeed. These things only happen when people are engaged in public life and make them happen. And I have to say, I teach a little bit, and I know a lot of younger people through my kids. I'm pretty impressed by a lot of people in the younger generation. They seem to know more than we did. A lot of them are more engaged. They're more aware of the, of what's happening in politics and what's happening in the world than we, and they're better informed. And I think they needed a leader, or they need something to galvanize around. I don't know that Harris will be that. Maybe she'll turn out to be that, or maybe she won't. But there is a desire for a different kind of politics. People don't want this fear and disaster and chaos and this heavy, nightmarish, the rambling ex-president going on and on for an hour and a half at the convention, going off on tangents. I mean, people want something different that they can support, and I see a lot of that around me, and I see it at book events. I see it all the time. People come up to me and say, "What can I do? How can I help?" And I tell people to do, get engaged. Work for a political party, or work on a campaign, or work for a local organization, or go and be a poll worker, or or run for office, or do something in local politics. And I think the more we can encourage people to do that, the better the future gets. I really believe that.
Well, Anne Applebaum, folks, it's a tremendous book. It's called Autocracy Inc., The Dictators Who Want to Run the World. It is a tremendous book. I really recommend it. We are coming up on our time with you tonight, Anne. I really appreciate you coming on the show. Stuart, Joe, thank you as always, gentlemen. Anne, we will talk to you again soon. And everybody, keep up the fight. And folks, we'll see you here again on the strategy session next week. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Anne.
Thanks, Anne. Take care.